Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. The music that you were hearing so far is music from Rajasthan to set the mood for what you're going to listen to shortly by today's speaker, Rustom Bharucha. So we wanted to create the ambiance for that, and we were playing some music from Rajasthan before that. Today we have, on the eve of the International Museum Day, which falls tomorrow, and the lecture that we are going to hear, illustrated lecture, is on grassroots museology in the Indian context, the making of Arna-Jharna, the desert museum of Rajasthan. And we have with us no less a person than Rustom Bharucha, author, research scholar, and cultural critic, to deliver this talk to us. I would like to request the Secretary and Curator of Victoria Memorial Hall, Dr. Joyanta Sengupta, to welcome the audience and introduce the speaker, please.
Good evening, everybody, and a very warm welcome to this evening's lecture, which we are doing in celebration of the International Museums Day, which is tomorrow, and 18th of May. And every year, this is the day, 18th May, tomorrow, is something that we treat as a sort of open day when we offer free admission to our garden and galleries to everybody. But also, in addition to that, we organize something which provides some kind of a food for thought for everybody who thinks about museums and who loves museums, some kind of a takeaway, a significant takeaway for those of us who work in museums, but also those who love and think about museums. And to give us that food for thought, to give the lecture for this evening, it's a privilege and honor to have with us here tonight Professor Rustom Bharucha. As all of you know, Professor Rustom Bharucha is one of our most preeminent authors, scholars, and cultural critics, who was till very recently the professor of theatre and performance studies in Jawaharlal Nehru University. And I will just mention some of his books to you. Many of these may already be familiar to you. He is the author of several books, including Theatre and the World, Performance and the Politics of Culture. The same book, Theatre of the World and the World, Performance and the Politics of Culture. The Question of Faith, In the Name of the Secular Contemporary Cultural Activism in India, The Politics of Cultural Practice, Thinking Through Theatre in an Age of Globalization, Rajasthan and Oral History, and I guess his lecture today will cover some of the ground covered in that book. Another Asia, Rabindranath Tagore and Okakura Tenshin, and most recently, Terror and Performance. He was the artistic director of 2 inter-Asian performance festivals of the Ramayana at the Adi Shakti Laboratory for Theatre Research in Pondicherry. And of course, he was the first project director of Arna-Jharna, the Desert Museum of Rajasthan, the museum that we wanted to look at on this International Museum Day. Over the past few months, we have been privileged to listen to and learn from some of the world leaders in the museum field, coming from such iconic institutions as the British Museum, the Georges Pompidou Center in Paris, and the Smithsonian. But for this International Museum Day, we didn't look towards those big fish, but we wanted to learn from a remarkable small museum, which is Arna-Jharna, the Desert Museum of Rajasthan, which uses the broom, or jhata or jharu, the broom, as a metaphor of life in the desert. It's a remarkable museum, and it is one of those very, very rare specialty museums which seek with very, very limited or no government support to speak for the voices of, to capture the voices of the small, the peripheral, the marginal, and so on and so forth. And we thought that that is the voice that we want to listen to in these times of big talks, in these times of tall claims, and so on and so forth. So we wanted to learn a few things from these small museums like Arna-Jharna, and it is a privilege for us that we have as our teacher and guide tonight, Professor Rustom Bharucha. So that's all I have to say for this evening. I look forward, like all of you, to a fascinating lecture. So ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Professor Rustom Bharucha to speak tonight on grassroots museology in the Indian context, the making of Arna-Jharna, the Desert Museum of Rajasthan. Thank you.
Before Rustom takes over the microphone, would you please hand over a small memento on behalf of Victoria
Thank you.
Memorial Hall?
Thank you.
to Rustom?
Thank you.
Right. And your lapel is on,
I
is it?
think it's on, yes.
Are your mobile phones or on? All are on? Why? They should be on, because if his lapel is on, your mobile phones should also be on. No? Okay. They are off? Thank you. Thank you very much for having done it before we told you to do so. Yeah? And after the thing, you will, of course, be taking some questions. All right?
By all means.
Yeah. Okay. Over to Rustom.
So thank you, both of you, very much for your very warm introduction. And it's a great honor for me to be speaking to you on the eve of International Museum Day. It's an important day. I have to be honest and tell you that for a very long time, I had a love-hate relationship with museums. I was skeptical about museums. But maybe it's age or whatever, or Arna-Jharna. But I feel we need museums, urgently need museums in this country, where museums are shamefully neglected, with very few exceptions. And I think the real question I want you all to think about today is the need for the museum. Why do we need museums? We live in a country where there are several pasts. We don't live with one past in India, we have hundreds of pasts. And these pasts are very much alive for us in India. They're not dead. We speak of living traditions. You know, they're all alive. I'm working at the moment on the Ramayana in performance traditions. There are hundreds of performance traditions of Ramayana in India. They're alive, you know. It's not like in Europe where most of them are dead. So why do we need to museumize the past, you know? Why do we need a separate building where we go over there and we look at objects and think of the past? Well, maybe there's a need. So today I'm going to share with you a little experiment. It's an experiment on a museum called Arna-Jharna, the Desert Museum of Rajasthan. Arna-Jharna literally means forest spring. There's no forest here, there's no spring here, but it's called Arna-Jharna. That's the name of the place. And it is located 1 hour outside Jodhpur on the road to Jaisalmer. And yes, he's already given away the secret of the Arna-Jharna. Could also be called the Broom Museum. It could also be called the Jharu Museum. And straight away, I should tell you, this was not my idea. This was the idea of this man you see here. His name is Komal Kothari. Komal Kothari was probably one of India's greatest, I don't know how to classify him. And it was his idea. We were merely implementing his idea. So who was Komal Kothari? I feel that what I have to do before I show you all the pictures of the museum, I have to tell you something about Komala and what he represented. And I have to tell you something about his knowledge. And I have to tell you something about the context for this museum. You see, today people think they can build museums like that. But they don't want to do the work that goes into museums. Museums take a long, long, long time before they get off the ground. Years and years of work. So that's what I'm going to share with you in the beginning. So Komalda, I would say, was indeed unclassifiable. At one level, you could say that he was the founder of what today we call Rajasthani folk music. Today there's a category, Rajasthani folk music. In the 50s, there was no Rajasthani folk music. It didn't exist. In the 50s in Jodhpur, he worked on a little magazine with a great friend of his, Priya Bandhu, Vijay Dan Detha, who is probably Rajasthan's greatest novelist, story writer. They were the thickest of friends. And so he began his journey by just documenting folk songs. And the first person he was documenting was a person from the Langa community. These are Muslim converts. And they were working as laborers in the Jodhpur bazaar. And from that time till 30 years down the line, something extraordinary happened, which we have not been able to document because nobody was around to document. And that is, Komalda created a repertoire of songs of langas, manganiyars, kalbelias, dholis across the desert regions of Rajasthan. By the 1980s, these desert musicians who were singing songs maybe 2 minutes, 3 minutes, were singing full concerts in Carnegie Hall, at the Kremlin, in Tokyo, in Edinburgh, in Adelaide, and all over India. It had become so strong. So you could say that Komalda was the founder of Rajasthani folk music. But does that mean he was an ethnomusicologist? Was he a musicologist? And the answer is no, he wasn't. But he did it. Likewise, you could say that Komalda was India's preeminent folklorist. And he had this knowledge. Knowledge is not information. Knowledge of people's living traditions of everyday life. So he was not really talking about so much literature. What did he talk about? Land, water, irrigation, livestock, oral epics, sati, teratali, Ramdev, puppetry, etc. There was nothing that he couldn't really talk about. He had that knowledge of people living in the desert. And when I met him, he was in touch with them for 50 years. That's a long time to be in touch with anybody, you know. But was he a folklorist? The answer is no. He was not trained in folklore, but there's no folklorist in the world from Chicago, from Finland, who would not have consulted him. He was the touchstone of the field. If you wanted to know anything about folklore, you had to go to Komalda. But he was not a folklorist. And likewise, you could say he's not an oral historian, he's not a storyteller, he's not a singer. Then what is he? You know, hard to say. I'd say he's a seer, he's a contemporary seer, he's a repository of knowledge, some kind of a walking encyclopedia, you know. And he was a talker. That's the most important thing. He could talk for 8 hours at a stretch, no problem. He should have been in the Guinness Book of Records, I tell you. 8 hours was nothing for Komalda. He just sit and aram se, you talk about everything, just like a river flowing. Go on like that. 8 hours. And you would not be able to stop listening. You could not stop listening. He had that quality in him. Now, the great folklorist A.K. Ramanujan had a beautiful essay once. He says, is there an Indian way of thinking? Well, this is probably the closest I've ever come to encountering something like an Indian way of thinking. So what was this Indian way of thinking? Let me give you concrete examples. So we'd be talking about soil, zameen, mitti. And he would talk about grass. He'd start talking about grass. And then he'd talk about sevan grass. Sevan grass, which grows up to 6-7 feet high in the rainfall season. So high that even camels walking through this grass can disappear. You won't even see them. He wasn't making a poetic image. He was just stating a fact. And he would then say, sevan grass area mein that is the bajra growing area, millet. If there's savan grass, there has to be bajra. And if there's a bajra growing area, then you can be sure you will hear the Ravanhatha. Ravanhatha is a fiddle. And if you hear the Ravanhatha, then you can be sure that you are going to listen to Pabuji. And Pabuji is the great brigand hero of one of the great oral epics of Rajasthan. He's a Bhomia. A Bhomia is a cattle martyr, somebody who lays down his life for cattle. And look at the way his mind is thinking. No? First he's talking about soil, then he's talking about grass, then he's talking about savan grass, then he's talking about camels, then he's talking about bajra, then he's talking about a musical instrument, and then he's talking about an oral epic. All within like a flow. Now, in today's world, in our theoretical language, which he didn't use, we use a word called rhizomatic. Rhizomatic thinking does not have a specific root and a specific end. It doesn't go from beginning to the end. Rhizomatic works like a network. It's like rivulets. He once told me that the lifeline of the desert is to be found in the rivulets, the little trickles of water. If you destroy the trickles of water, the ecology will be destroyed, which is what has happened, you know. So it was this way of thinking, this flow of thinking. I have not encountered this in anybody else. So I met him in '86. I came under the spell of his conversation. I didn't meet him for 14 years. Then I met him in Delhi at a conference on documentation. Boring, you know what these conferences can be. But there he was, holding forth on intellectual property rights. Now, everybody in the postmodern world will talk intellectual property rights, but they don't know anything about it. They haven't had any experience of it. He was talking out of experience. So a little bit of history. Our strongest documentation of Rajasthani folk music was made in 1972. And it was initiated by an ethnomusicologist from the Musée de l'Homme called Geneviève Dourneau, who had the funding to come to Jodhpur, and she and Komalda and a team, they toured the length and breadth of Rajasthan to document, and that is still around in the archive. And out of that documentation, 2 LPs were made. In those days, there were no cassettes, just LP, long playing records. And then many years later, one insurance company from New York wanted to use 10 seconds of some flute piece for some television commercial. So the whole question became, how do you negotiate the royalties? It was a huge issue. It's all in my book, which you may read. So listening to him talk with so much ground reality of intellectual property rights, I realized something very ironic. I said, here we are in a conference on documentation, and here we are listening to somebody who's probably one of the greatest thinkers of rural India, and nobody has documented him. Isn't that interesting? And that's very characteristic of a lot of our great treasures in India. They just go undocumented. So I went up to him, I said, Komalda, can I come and talk to you and spend time with you? He said, Joe, no problem. So we started a conversation, and it lasted for 3 years. And I wrote a book that came out of those conversations, which you may read. It's called Rajasthan, an Oral History, Conversations with Komal Kothari, and I'm very proud of that book, I have to say. I'm very glad it was written. So I bring it up because I haven't mentioned a word about museums. We didn't talk museums. But without this book, without some understanding of land, water, irrigation, livestock, oral epics, sati, Tiratali, Ramdev, etc., etc., there's no context in which to talk about this museum. So I was very lucky, very accidentally, you might say, you know, the context was there before the museum started. So the book came out, and I was back in Kolkata, and Komaldar had one passion left. He was dying, he had cancer, and he, he knew he didn't have long to live. So he had one passion, and that passion was to build a museum. And I first thought, what a strange idea. This is the most non-systematic man I have ever met in my life. He never keeps a list of anything. He's most disorganized. How is he ever going to run a museum? Wrong career choice, you know. And he wanted to build ethnographic museum. Now, ethnographic museum. Now, everybody in my field, you know, as a theorist, I know there's a lot of problems we have with ethnography, etc. But he had one, like, spot-on idea. I mean, those are the big thinkers. He says this museum will begin with one object, the jharu. And all of us who knew him very well said, he's lost it. You know, what has a jharu got to do with a museum? You know, come on. It's too folkloric for words, etc. And I can only say with due humility, after he passed on and I became the project director of this museum, which I named Arna-Jharna, and having worked on brooms for 3 years of my life, I can tell you that idea is nothing short of genius. And I don't use that word loosely. It is genius. Why is it genius? Because it tells you that if you take something very ordinary in life, very marginal in life, very common in life, very mamuli, shadharan, not worth thinking about in life, and you think about it very, very, very seriously, and you think about the jharu with as much intensity as you would think about a sculpture or a painting or a tapestry or the Taj Mahal or whatever, and you give the jharu that much intensity of thought, the world can open up. That's what I learned. So how does the world open up? In many ways. First, let's begin with the materiality of the broom. What is the material of the broom?